I'm Tom. I'm an alcoholic. Sober today. I'd like to report that I woke up this morning in a funny time zone. The clocks were different. Everything was confusing. I did not know what ocean I was looking at. But it's better. It's better. It takes a little time. I've been asked to do some reflections on steps 10 and 11. Step 10, continue to take personal inventory. And when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. Praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So I want to share some of my experience and some strength and some hope and some ideas on this, and encourage you to share your own experience with others. Continue to take personal inventory. The stories told of the Buddha 2,500 years ago. He was raised in a very privileged and wealthy family in India, and his parents were loving parents with a lot of resources, and like many parents, they wanted to make sure that their child never had a bad day and never suffered and never had difficulties, because they had difficulties and we want to protect our children. A lot of people want to do that. And so as a young person, he was a bird in a gilded cage. And as a teenager, he sneaks out. Kids sneak out. And he got off the compound and discovered outside his venue there was poverty and suffering and disease and famine and illness and misery. And it was a huge spiritual crisis. How on earth is this possible? And let me try to make sense out of this. And he tries to do everything that his tradition and his culture tells him to do. As a Hindu, doing a million things that Hindu people do. And none of it seemed to take the edge off. And finally he's under a tree and he has a moment of enlightenment, and things fall into place and he figures some things out. And then he goes around, he's very peaceful, he goes around telling people, doing some teaching, doing some interchange with people, and he's no longer fearful and agitated and crazed. And people said to him, are you one of the gods? He said, no, I'm not one of the gods. Are you a guru? He says, no, I'm not a guru. They said, are you a prophet? I'm not a prophet. And they said, well, then what are you? And his response was, I am awake. I am awake. And I like that language, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, being awake, paying attention, continuing to take inventory. And I keep falling asleep, and I know that because I keep waking up. And all of a sudden it's November. You know, how did that happen? And I try to do this a day at a time. But at the end of the day, to do an inventory of the day is a very, very good spiritual practice. And I was taught to do that before I joined the program. It became something I ignored doing rather than doing for a long time. But at the end of the day, reviewing the day. And I heard someone share recently, and this is from page 86 of the book. When we retire at night, we constructively review our day. We constructively review the day. Were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? I get those. Do we owe an apology? I've had to do that. Have we kept something to ourselves which should be discussed with another person at once. Well, I didn't even notice that that was in here until very recently. But I've had that experience. I should talk to him about this. I should talk to her about this. Something's bothering me. I need to have a conversation sooner rather than later. I've held on to some stuff for days and weeks and months, and it's made me ill. It's made me unhappy. It sure has shut me down. If you have sponsees, and I hope you have some, they will make you work your program. Some of the calls I get from the folks I sponsor, some things come up that they need to talk about right away. I went to the Atlanta AA convention. I've been to most of the conventions. I missed a couple, but I like them. My sponsor made me go to the one in New Orleans in 1980. Marty Mann was still alive, and Lois Wilson were there. And Saturday night, they waved at everybody. Hello, hello. I waved back. And I was, that's a moment. I had 4 years clean and sober, and I remember talking about that. And one of our friends in recovery is Sandy Beach, who passed recently. Sandy was sober forever and a force for good. We agreed on nothing, and we were good friends. And I was talking with Sandy about that wonderful night in New Orleans where I saw Marty Mann and Lois Wilson waving at everybody. And he got a little quiet, and he looked at me and said, "Do you know who spoke that night?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "I did." I said, "Oh." Well, I remember waving back at Lois Wilson. I don't remember listening to you, so there. Atlanta, I was upset. I was missed a plane, spent a night at O'Hare, sleep deprived, crazy. I was upset, and I knew I needed to talk to my sponsor, and he was there, and I had to tell him about my upset. And just sharing it with him took the edge off. What a gift of being able to do that. Were we kind and loving toward all? Usually not. I'm really glad when I'm kind and loving to some. In fact, I'm glad when I'm kind and loving to anyone. What could we have done better? Were we thinking of ourselves most of the time? You don't have to raise your hand, but I do that a lot. How am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing now? Phone rings, it's a sponsee. You have to listen, you have to listen. You hang up, and the next thought is, how am I doing now? You know, that self-obsession. Were we thinking of what we could do for others, of what we could pack into the stream of life? But we must be careful not to drift into worry, remorse, or morbid reflection. Now, I love worry, and I think remorse is sweet. I think self-pity is such a nice way to spend a weekend. There's a je ne sais quoi, morbid reflection. After making our review, we ask God's forgiveness and inquire what corrective measures should be taken. What Bill writes about in that paragraph is a very old monastic practice, to review the day. And when I was much younger, long before recovery, when I would review the day, it was usually looking for the negative. And so by the end of my reflection, I was pretty aware that I had had a pretty negative day. selfish, did this, did that, did this, did that. And now when I review the day, I follow these suggestions, but I've also been trained to review the day looking for moments where the higher power was present. In the course of the day, have I had any experience of a power greater than myself, present, active, moving? Review the day, training myself to look for the presence of the higher power on a regular basis. One of my friends, Vietnam vet, long sobriety, would talk about his training during the war, jungle fighting, jungle existence. And he said, you were trained to look. And what I do usually is I look right ahead. When I'm driving, I look right ahead. I want to pay attention to what's right there. And he said, but what we were taught in the jungle was just don't look ahead. You also have to have a sense of vision on the right-hand side and the left-hand side. Your eyes have to be very wide and open. And my experience of looking for the higher power is I keep on looking for right here, I want it there, I want the bush, I want a big bush, and I want it on fire. And then I can say, I have seen the higher power. And that hasn't happened yet. But when I'm aware of the periphery, something over here or something over here, I become very aware of the present, of the fact that this is the power in whom I live and move and have my being. In whom we live and move and have our being. I know some people who do a written 10th step every night. I've never been able to do that. I have a much simpler process of reviewing the day and looking at the specific, when did I wake up? What did I have for breakfast? Who did I talk to? Where have I been? Did I do any driving? Where did I drive? What happened around lunchtime today? Anyone I have a conversation with? Did I meet anybody in the program? Did I return some phone calls? What was the topic of our discussion? Did I go to a meeting? Was I helpful? Was someone else helpful? Did I hear something useful? I want to be awake to that at the end of every day and train myself to pay attention. In Old Testament and New Testament, there's an awful lot of prayers offered. But a consistent one, a couple of consistent ones, have to do with hearing and vision. Help me hear better. Help me respond better. Help me see better. Help me understand better. The seeing and the hearing. And at the end of the day, when I review my day, I ask myself, what have I heard? What have I seen? What have I experienced? And I want to keep it very practical and very simple and at my fingertips. Because if I'm not careful, I don't pay attention to anything. I just get distracted. Oh, Law and Order. Judge Judy. You know? How's your day? I don't know. I've been busy, with my friends on Law and Order, and for the last month, Judge Judy's been my sponsor, and I might need some fine-tuning. I think I'm getting separated from. But the 10th step is such a practical thing. It's such a practical thing of reviewing my day, and also what I've been trained and taught At the beginning of any spiritual exercise, such as a meeting or hearing a fifth step or doing a 10th step, I ask the higher power for help. Help me pay attention, help me listen, help me see, help me be attentive to. I do have a couple of friends who do very, very long, complicated 10 steps. It's exhausting. Just listening to it makes me feel very inadequate and bad and wrong. I have to have something that's simple and accessible, reviewing the day. Asking some of the questions here on page 86. Put my glasses on. Page 86. But adding that new one, which I had not noticed until about 2 months ago, have I kept something to myself which should be discussed with another person at once? I've had the same sponsor for a very long time. And we have trained each other, you know. He was 5 years sober when he became my sponsor, and I thought he knew everything, and he almost did. Learning how to work with him, getting him to know me, me getting to know him. And it wasn't so much what I heard him say as what I saw him do. I learned a lot by watching him interact with others. The way he treated people, the way he treated meetings with respect, the way he showed up on time, the way he participated. He took me to a meeting in Los Angeles. I had just moved down there. This would have been in 1977, and I was moving to Los Angeles, and I didn't know. I'd been drunk in Los Angeles for 5 years. I'd never been sober there. So I wrote the Archbishop, Timothy Manning, who was a good man, and I said, I'm coming into your territory, and I'm an alcoholic in recovery. I'll almost have a year. And are there any priests sober in the neighborhood? And he wrote me back, and he welcomed me, and he said, when you get to town, call Father Terry. So I gave name and phone number. I got to town on a Friday, and I went to a meeting Friday, 2 on Saturday, 2 on Sunday, called Terry Monday. And I said, I'm new in town, I need a sponsor. I'm sober a year, I'm teaching, I don't know how to do anything. I'm just so freaked out by being alive. And he picked me up and took me to a meeting that he has, that was originally a meeting for priests. And it turned into a men's stag over the years, and it meets every Monday night still. And in the middle of the room, they sit in a circle. It's a round-robin discussion. In the middle of the room, they have a little white flag, which no one ever talks about. But it's put there. And then I think someone takes it home and brings it back and puts it in the middle of the room for years. And this meeting, the first one I went to, was in the back of the Episcopal Cathedral. It's now the Bonaventure Hotel. It was an old wooden building, wooden stairs. The AA meeting was in a room with no ventilation at all. Everyone smoked. It's kind of Skid Row-y. Guys from recovery houses were there. And as we're getting in the meeting, the guy in front of me is still smells a little bit of booze, and he's a little sedated, and as he's walking up these old wooden steps into a room with no ventilation and a lot of cigarette smoke, his sphincter relaxed, and he soiled himself, and he was not awake enough to notice, and he kept going into the room. I noticed. I was awake at that moment to horror. And there was a guy in the meeting, he was a Hollywood stuntman, I find out later. He had a shaved head and a Taurus bulba mustache and a barrel chest, and And when he got downwind of our friend, he vomited quickly and suddenly and dramatically. And I saw my sponsor walk up to the guy who had vomited. Said, "Are you okay?" Oh, he said, "I'm fine. I just got downwind. I'll be okay." And my sponsor said to him, "Why don't you get the kitty litter?" Why don't you get the kitty litter? Which means this has happened before. They cleaned up the vomit and they cleaned up the mess. And my sponsor went over to the guy who had soiled himself, who still didn't even know that he was soiled. And my sponsor said to him, "Looks like you could use some friends." And a couple of the guys from the halfway house were there, and they went down to the men's room and cleaned him up and washed him off and got, rinsed some things out, and the meeting started on time. At the end of the day, as I reviewed that meeting, I was very aware that I had seen 3 or 4 or 5 traditions at work. Everyone's welcome. The common welfare comes first. We carry the message and always have some kitty litter available. The book talks about love and service as being our code. When I review the day, has there been any service? Has there been any love? I think those are good questions. And are there moments that I can point to? Consciousness, an awareness, a being awake, a reviewing the day. And when I have been wrong, I want to promptly admit it. I have a little trouble with authority figures, and it's chronic. I hate them. But I want them to like me, so there's tension. And it shows up in lots of ways. Usually I try to seduce them with charm, but they just scare me to death. And we had a new boss, and I was having an exchange with the boss, and it didn't help that the new boss was a boy I taught in high school, who now was king, and I flunked him on a paper, which I didn't remember, but he did. So we're having a conversation, and it's about my community in Oakland. We have a little Jesuit house in Oakland, and there's 5 of us that live there, 4 of us sometimes, 5 and 2 cats. And we were discussing a few things, and the boss asked a question concerning, is this community going to stay open or not? I was quite surprised by the question, and I lied. To protect the group. Can't you lie for the good of the group? I'm sure that's in a footnote somewhere that you can do that. And I lied because I was caught by surprise and I was frightened and I wanted to protect everybody, and so I lied. Now, at this time I had some sobriety. I can still lie, I want you to know this, but it really tastes bad. And part of reviewing the day that we were trained to do is, in the course of your day, have you done anything that has left you with a bad taste in the mouth? On the way back to Oakland, I was talking with my companion, and we talked about the lie. And it was uncomfortable. It tasted so bad. I just can't get away with it. It really bothered me. And I slept. I reviewed the day, knowing I had to promptly admit it. And the next morning I wrote His Majesty an email. And I'm not going to grovel or do that because that's not really effective. Instead, I kept it very simple. I've been trained to do that, keep it simple. And I simply said, yesterday, when you asked me about X, I gave a response which wasn't very useful. Here's a better response. And I told him the truth. I want to admit promptly. I want to be awake promptly. I want to respond promptly. I don't want to hold on to old stuff that just knocks me out of balance. I like the 12 and 12. I think it would be a better book if it had pictures, but I like the 12 and 12. And when it talks about the 10th step, it talks about nursing a grudge. And I love the image, cute little grudge. There at your breast, suck deeply, sweet grudge. I want you to stay alive. Nursing a grudge. And I don't want to do that anymore. The 10th step helps me let go of lots of stuff that I could hold on to for generation after generation after generation. I want to be free of that. More than one of the speakers yesterday spoke about being free to be here now as an adult grown-up person. The 10th step helps me do that. When I fall asleep again, when I wake up, I know it's time perhaps to do a more serious 10th step. But at the end of the day, reviewing the day is a very good spiritual practice. The 11th step talks about prayer and meditation. There's zillions of books written on prayer and meditation. I've read some of them, not all of them. I've read some of them. I have also been trained to have at my fingertips half a dozen different ways of praying and meditating. Because when one doesn't work, you can shift to the other, or shift to the other, or shift to the other. And I think that's a useful thing. There can be big discussions on, well, exactly how do you do this right? Well, when I was a novice, I joined the Jesuit community when I was 18 years old. I've been in for over 50 years. You'd think I'd be a better person by now, but I'm really not. But I was a very young person, and they had us praying and meditating immediately. Bell would ring at 5 a.m. It's like electricity hadn't been invented. Bells rang. You were to shave and wash and run around and get dressed and be at your desk at 5:30 for 45 minutes of meditation. And they had a big book, and they had other things. And you learned to swim by being thrown into the pool. They didn't discuss the theory and then let you put your toe in. They just threw you in the deep end. And 15 minutes kneeling, a bell would ring. 15 minutes standing, a bell would ring. 15 minutes sitting, a bell would ring. And then you go to the chapel for Mass in the morning. So the day is well launched by 6 a.m. And years later I asked, the training was very monastic. And at a few years after that, I asked the folks in charge, why did they have us stand for 15 minutes, kneel for 15 minutes, sit for 15 minutes? Why that? And the response was, to keep you awake. Well, how practical. How practical. And every so often I find in prayer and meditation I need to stand up or sit down or walk or swim or run, something to help stay awake because I can get very distracted and very shut down. Prayer and meditation. If a lot of times I find prayer and meditation ordinary, routine, and boring. Every so often it's magic. But most of the time it's very ordinary. And there are so many different things, so many different ways. There are meditation books. Al-Anon has several of them. AA has one. When I was newly sober, a little black book a lot of us were using was the 24-hour-a-day book, which is pretty much a thought for the day. Hazelden has 12 million meditation books on every possible subject. My tendency is to own the complete collection. And never use them, of course, but they're on display, right? You know, a copy of the big book, a copy of the variety of religious experience, you know, a dictionary, the Bible. I mean, I want my sponsees to see what's on my shelf. It's better to have one or two or three that you use than a whole bunch you don't use. And find one that speaks to you, or find two that speaks to you. One of my friends in recovery, he's a priest up in Tacoma, Washington, German background, very organized. Alles ist Ordnung in his world. He uses, we've roomed together a couple of times, 5 meditation books, which he uses every morning in exactly the same order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm not that organized. When I travel, I have several things I bring with me to have access to. Some people pray the Psalms. There's happy Psalms and sad Psalms, and there's 150 of them. Some are full of blessing, some are full of cursing. I like the cursing Psalms myself very much. But I don't think that counts as meditation. That might be controversial. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God. Where in the course of the day has the higher power been present? Where have I noticed activity or change? Improving conscious contact, not emotional contact. Emotions come and go. Even when I'm not feeling very much, I can be aware of the fact that a power greater than myself is at work. If something's beautiful or stunning, it helps. Sunrise, sunset aren't a bad way to start or end the day. Watching that which is beautiful. Nature is a big connector for a lot of us with prayer and meditation. Out on the west, west of Dodge City, Kansas, Yosemite National Park. John Muir, who's one of the founders of the national park system, he and President Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir will say, if you want to see the face of God, come to Yosemite. And you see this magnificent granite canyon full of life. For some of us, the connecting place is the desert. A pilgrimage to New Mexico is life-changing. For some of us, it's oceans. For some of us, it's mountains. There's a whole thing in Greek mythology and the Old Testament and Matthew's Gospel where a lot of God stuff happens on mountains. People go there. Architecture. There are some things built by human hands that will take your breath away. There are places people go on pilgrimage. People will go to Jerusalem, to Canterbury, to Rome, to Akron. I know some people who would like to turn Akron into Bethlehem. I resist that, but that's me. An international conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, pilgrimage. What I've discovered with the conferences is I really don't like them. And at the same time, it's very important for me to be there. Because it's so uncomfortable. All these people I don't know, I'm going to get stretched. I'm going to end up giving directions to someone who doesn't speak English. And you fall in love over and over and over again with all of these languages and shapes and colors and sizes of the women and men, old and young, in recovery. Saw it through prayer and meditation. I think the Hollywood image of prayer and meditation is that it works very, very quickly, and you will be a saint in 24 hours. If I pray and meditate on a daily basis, surely by the end of the week, I'll have my own TV show, and line of books. It's not how it works. There was a movie. I'm a TV watcher. I have no secrets from you. I watch TV. I have watched Hoarders. I admit it. I feel better about myself right afterwards, and that's the point. I'll sneak a look at Jerry Springer, expecting to see members of my family there, at any moment. We had people, uncles fighting nieces over a will. It was just awful. In my family, we have one of my nephews married a Chinese Indonesian girl. They have perfect daughters. We have Jehovah's Witnesses, we have Mormons, we have Catholics, we have Episcopalians, we have Muslims, we have Asians. We are a very modern American family. And it's kind of wonderful to see people getting along ever so carefully, ever so carefully. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve conscious contact with a power greater than ourselves. So the Hollywood image, and the TV movie was Gunsmoker, Wagon Train. I think it was Wagon Train. Brave people going across the prairies, and there was always chaos and trouble and difficulty. And in one of these things, it was a group of sisters, a group of nuns, all wearing their hijabs, going across the prairie. And I think Diana Ross was the head nun in this particular thing. And there were locusts and bandits and difficulties and plagues and earthquakes. And, what are we going to do? And everyone's running around confused. And Sister Diana said, "I will pray." And she fell on her knees and looked all confused and twisted and ooh. And then all of a sudden, it's like she's hearing voices. And then she's just bright with insight and answers. And she stands up and she says, "God has answered our prayers. We turn left." And they get off the thing. And it's time for a commercial. So what I'd like to say about that is whoever wrote that scene doesn't pray. That's how they think it works, but that's not how it works. Prayer is, to my understanding, it's not about us changing God or figuring God out. It's about us being changed by the experience. Rumi, the great Sufi poet, will talk about his prayer experience as the process of his being turned into a well-baked loaf of bread. O Lord, Allah, turn me into a well-baked loaf. which means you get stirred and mixed and made wet and kneaded and pounded and ignored and pounded again, and you rise. And then you get baked. My sponsor's spin on this, and he's a sober Monsignor, they are very rare. If you pray and meditate on a regular basis for a period of years, you will be less of a jerk. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. Lying will make you uncomfortable. Being rude will make you unhappy. Being impatient will ruin your day. Shoving someone out of the way because they're inconvenient will bother you. We become sensitized and more sensitive, looking only for knowledge of God's will for us. I usually go to meetings for me because I'm very self-obsessed and cranky, and I need the direction. I need the hope. I run out of hope pretty quickly. I need the hope of being at a meeting. By the end of the day, my hope is pretty much used up, and I need a whole new load of hope in the morning. So I was at a meeting, and one of our fellows who's younger a lot wanted my professional keen insight on stuff. And he said, "So, Tom, what's God's will? What's God's will?" And I'm, and I kind of blew him off. But he was insistent. He said, "What's God's will?" And I said, okay, how's this? Don't lie, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. How's that? And he said, "Oh, that's so negative." Well, yes, but nevertheless, it gives some direction, What are those activities that cut me off from the sunlight of the Spirit? I don't want to do those. What else is God's will? The laws of physics are God's will. These are invented by God. The laws of physics, astronomy, biology, digestion. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired is all God's will. As in not getting too hungry, angry, lonely, tired. I asked my sponsor, he was having a really good day, and you want to take advantage of that, Save up your questions for the good day. And I said, "What's God's will?" And he said, "It is God's will for each of us to have a life. Go get one." Which means by making decisions and saying yes to some things and no to some things and developing that sense of freedom and identity and connectedness, building the bridges we need to bridge. What's God's will? One of the great rabbis, Hillel, teacher, long ago and far away, but he was quoted saying that he could recite the entire text of Scripture on one foot. Well, that'll get people excited. And so a bunch of excited people demanded that he show them that he could do all of Scripture on one foot. And he stood on one foot and said, "Love God and love your neighbor." That's it. Well, it can't be that simple. Oh, that's right. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How's that? Don't do to other people what you don't want other people to do to you. How's that? Don't be a jerk. Build bridges, say hello, welcome the newcomer. Say hello to the old-timer. Show up on time, participate. Say yes. What's God's will? I've had the privilege of studying under a couple of rabbis. One was Rabbi David Winston, who was a very interesting fellow Reform rabbi. He was quite fascinated by the Jewish community in Greek-speaking Alexandria, Philo-Judaeus. It was a fascinating course. Learned a lot. But another rabbi I studied with was Orthodox Rabbi Joseph Leibowitz, who had a little congregation in Berkeley, and he was teaching classes on Judaism Tuesday nights, and I would go because I'm figuring we have so much in common, and anything I learn is very helpful for me, professionally and personally. And he knew I was a priest, and we'd have occasional shop talk conversations, and I'm a high school teacher, and teachers can spot teachers. I mean, and this guy was a master teacher. And he talked about a lot of Jewish stuff. He talked about Genesis and Abraham and Moses. I mean, all the big shots, Noah. And he would take questions. And part of the Jewish tradition is you never answer a question. I mean, that you ask a question back. That's the teaching method. And anyway, so he was doing a whole bunch of stuff, and he talked about blessings and people being blessed and blessings and people being blessed. And he finally, a woman in the class said, "Rabbi, what is a blessing? You keep saying, what is a blessing?" And I would have given a very quick response like, well, it's God's seal of approval, which that's more shallow than even me, so. But rabbis don't do that. Rabbis, they're thoughtful, by and large. And he took the question and he, ran it around in his head, and he fussed with his beard, which is why we have beards. And he said, when God created everything in 6 days. And at the end of each day of creation, God looked at what God had made and said, this is good, this is good. Dry land, sun, moon, stars, cows, goats, avocados, good. And on the sixth day, God creates the human being and doesn't say anything. There is a strain of thought among some of the rabbis that this is still day number 6, by the way. We aren't done yet. Back to the story. He said, and God doesn't say anything, any conclusions? And somebody, well, people are no good. And he said, well, he said, that's a possible conclusion, and that's why it's a bad translation. He said, in English, the word good means so many different things. There's, a good day and have a good day and the good book and a good book and for a good time call. Good means a lot of different things. And then he said, in Hebrew, and then he looked at me and said, which is what God spoke. God looked at what God had made and said, this is Tov, T-O-V, this is Tov. And what does Tov mean? Tov means something is complete, It's entire. It's exactly the way it's supposed to be. The dry land, the sun, the moon, the stars, avocados. They're exactly the way they're supposed to be. But people are not created complete. We're created with lots of holes and empty places and unfinished business. We're born male. It takes a lifetime to become a man. We're born female. It takes a lifetime of experiences and decisions and choices to become a woman. We're born male, female. It takes a lifetime of life to become a real human being, a mensch. And then he said, anything that pushes you ahead in your development, anything that drags you forward in your maturity, anything that takes hold of you when you're tiny and whiny and difficult and brittle and pushes and shoves and moves until suddenly there's a lot more room. Anything that does that, said the rabbi, is a blessing. And sometimes blessings don't feel very good. And sometimes you do not know it was a blessing until years later, when you look back on it and you look at something that you thought was going to kill you, and instead it opened up doors you never even knew were there. Listening to him, I understood for the first time how my alcoholism was a blessing, and how recovery is a blessing, and how a power greater than ourselves working through the women and men of the program and the steps and the tools take us who are frightened and rigid and angry and fearful beings, and turns us into the women and men of Alcoholics Anonymous. Doesn't happen quickly. Sometimes it happens ever so subtly, but we do become bread for each other. And I have to go to meetings on a regular basis to remember that. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out one day at a time. That's what I know.
Okay, we're going to come back at 10. We're going to